The radar operator's hands were shaking. It was just past midnight on July 24th, 1943, and Oberfeldwebel Hartmann had been watching German skies for 2 years. He knew what a bomber formation looked like on his Freya scope. Clean signatures, distinct patterns, aircraft he could count, track, vector fighters toward. But this was different. His screen had just exploded into chaos, where there should have been maybe 30, 40 contacts inbound toward Hamburg. His radar was screaming at him that there were thousands. The entire display had turned into a solid mass of light. No patterns, no formations, just an impossible blizzard of returns that made absolutely no sense. Hartmann reached for the intercom, his throat tight. Equipment malfunction. Had to be. Except the operator at the next station was already standing, staring at his own screen with the same expression of disbelief. Then the sirens began to wail across Hamburg. Here's what Hartmann didn't know, what no German defender knew that night. Most of those aircraft signatures didn't exist. They were phantoms, ghosts created by something so simple, so absurdly cheap, that when German scientists finally got their hands on it hours later, they would struggle to accept what they were seeing. Strips of aluminum foil, that's it. Metal foil cut into pieces smaller than a ruler, each one costing less than a penny. Tons of it, tumbling through the darkness, turning the most sophisticated air defense network ever built into a billion-dollar blind spot. The British had a code name for it, Window. And the Germans were about to learn that you can pour infinite resources into technology, hire the brightest minds, build systems that feel invincible, and still have it all collapse because of something a child could make with scissors and kitchen supplies. But Window was just the delivery mechanism. What happened in Hamburg over the next 10 days would create something far worse than any raid before it. Something that would kill more people in a single night than died in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. Something that even the crews dropping the bombs hadn't fully anticipated. A firestorm, a self-sustaining hurricane of flame with winds over 100 miles per hour and temperatures hot enough to melt asphalt. 8 square miles of a living city turned to ash, while 40,000 people died in ways that still disturb historians 80 years later. And it all began with a decision that Winston Churchill agonized over for months. Because once he authorized Window, once that secret was out, there would be no taking it back. The Germans would copy it, the advantage would vanish, and British cities, which had barely survived the Blitz, would face a new threat. But RAF Bomber Command was bleeding to death. In the spring of 1943, air crews had less than a 30% chance of surviving 30 missions. That's not a war of attrition. That's a death sentence with paperwork. Something had to change. This is the story of how British scientists turned Hitler's greatest strength into his catastrophic weakness. How innovation worth pennies defeated engineering worth billions. How one raid changed aerial warfare forever and created one of history's deadliest nights. This is Operation Gomorrah, and it started with a Welsh physicist who understood that the best weapon against a sophisticated enemy might be the simplest thing imaginable. The photo reconnaissance images spread across the table told a story no one in RAF Bomber Command wanted to hear. Empty chairs at breakfast tables across England, squadrons that had deployed with full rosters now operating at half strength. Some stations had lost so many crews they could barely maintain operations. Between March and July 1943, Bomber Command had lost over 1,000 aircraft. Not damaged, lost, gone. The mathematics were brutal and impossible to ignore. At current rates, strategic bombing would collapse before it could achieve anything meaningful. Air Marshal Arthur Harris stood in his operations room, studying loss reports that read like obituaries. He was known as Bomber Harris, a man convinced that Germany could be defeated from the air alone if given enough resources. But conviction doesn't replace crews, and Harris was running out of young men willing to climb into bombers that had become flying coffins. The problem had a name: Kammhuber-Lieren. General Joseph Kammhuber had built something unprecedented, an integrated air defense network stretching from Denmark to Switzerland. Radar stations that could see bombers coming from over 70 miles away. Tracking systems accurate enough to guide night fighters directly onto their targets. Anti-aircraft batteries that no longer fired blind barrages but calculated precise firing solutions based on real-time data. It worked. God, did it work. German night fighters, primarily Messerschmitt, Bf-110s, equipped with Liechtenstein airborne radar, were massacring bomber streams. The system had evolved into a killing machine so efficient that Luftwaffe aces were achieving success rates previous generations of pilots couldn't have imagined. For British aircrews, the fear wasn't abstract. You climbed into a Lancaster or Halifax knowing that German radar could see you coming, that controllers on the ground were already vectoring fighters toward your position, that somewhere in the darkness a Bf-110 was closing in, its radar operator watching a blip on his scope that represented your life counting down. Some crews never saw what killed them, just a burst of cannon fire from below and behind, hydraulics exploding, fuel tanks igniting, men trapped in a burning aircraft spinning toward Earth. Others had seconds to react. Dive, corkscrew, pray the rear gunners spotted them first. Most times it didn't matter. The Liechtenstein radar gave German pilots an edge that turned air combat into execution. By summer 1943, the situation had reached a tipping point. Harris needed a solution, or needed to admit that strategic bombing had failed. Either way, young men were dying at a rate that made their odds worse than infantry on the Eastern Front. The answer existed. Had existed for months, actually, sitting in a secure facility, tested and proven. A technology so effective that it terrified the very people who developed it. Because using it meant giving it away. Dr. Joan Curran didn't look like someone who would change warfare. She was a Welsh physicist working at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, one of dozens of brilliant minds recruited to solve military problems through science. Quiet, methodical, the kind of researcher who approached problems with elegant simplicity rather than brute complexity. The principle she'd identified was almost embarrassingly basic. Radar worked by bouncing radio waves off objects. Metal reflected those waves extremely well. If you could flood German radar with reflections from something other than aircraft, you could overwhelm the operators. The solution? Aluminum foil strips cut to specific lengths matching German radar frequencies. Each strip, tumbling through the air, would reflect radio waves just like a bomber. Drop enough of them and German radar screens would show thousands of targets where only dozens actually existed. Curran's team tested the concept in late 1942. The results exceeded every expectation. A handful of foil bundles created radar signatures equivalent to a heavy bomber formation. The material was cheap, lightweight, easy to manufacture. Any aircraft could carry thousands of bundles without significantly affecting performance. They called it Window and immediately locked it away in the highest security classification Britain possessed. Because Window had a fatal flaw. Once used, the secret was out. The Germans would find the foil strips, analyze them, and have their own version operational within weeks, maybe days. And when they did, British radar defenses would face the same blindness now protecting German skies. The debate that followed was brutal. Air Marshal Harris pushed for immediate deployment. His crews were dying. Window could save hundreds of lives. Every day they waited, more bombers went down over Germany. Fighter Command pushed back hard. They were responsible for defending British cities. If the Luftwaffe got Window, if German bombers could suddenly penetrate British radar defenses the way RAF bombers would penetrate German defenses, the Blitz could return. Only this time, Britain's radar network, the system that had saved the nation in 1940, would be useless. The argument consumed months. Spring turned to summer. Bomber Command losses mounted. Harris grew increasingly desperate, practically begging the Air Ministry for authorization. Fighter Command remained adamant. The risk was too great. Then, Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, head of scientific intelligence, provided the analysis that broke the deadlock. His team had been monitoring German bomber strength, studying Luftwaffe deployments, tracking aircraft production. The conclusion was clear. By mid-1943, Germany simply didn't have the bomber force necessary to threaten Britain anymore. The vast majority of German aircraft were committed to the Eastern Front, supporting ground operations against the Soviet Union. Others defended German airspace against Allied raids. The Luftwaffe's strategic bombing capability had been gutted by years of attrition and misallocation. Even if the Germans got window, even if they could penetrate British radar, they lacked the bombers to exploit the advantage. Meanwhile, RAF Bomber Command was building toward 1,000 aircraft raids. The disparity was staggering. Britain could put more bombers over one German city in a single night than the Luftwaffe could put over all of England in a month. The math supported Harris. The risk, while real, was manageable. But the decision ultimately rested with one man. Winston Churchill received the brief in his underground war rooms in June 1943. The statistics were undeniable. Bomber Command was losing aircraft at rates that would soon make operations unsustainable. Window could cut those losses dramatically. Intelligence suggested the Germans hadn't discovered the technique yet, but were working on similar concepts. The window of opportunity, ironically named, was closing. Churchill had reservations. He'd lived through the Blitz, watched London burn, knew what it meant when defenses failed and bombers got through. But he also understood that Britain needed this strategic bombing campaign to work, needed to keep pressure on Germany, needed to convince Stalin that the Western Allies were serious about the war. On July 15, 1943, Churchill authorized Operation Gomorrah. Hamburg would be the target, and Window would be used for the first time in combat. The name itself carried weight. Gomorrah, the biblical city destroyed by fire from heaven. Harris wasn't being subtle about his intentions. Hamburg wasn't chosen randomly. Germany's second-largest city, a major industrial center, home to shipyards building U-boats that were strangling Atlantic convoys. The city sat on the Elbe River, relatively close to British bases, making it accessible for sustained operations. And most importantly, Hamburg was heavily defended. It would provide the ultimate test of Window's effectiveness. British industry went into overdrive. Aluminum foil, already in short supply due to aircraft manufacturing, had to be diverted to window production. Cutting machines ran around the clock, producing thousands of bundles. Each bundle weighed about half a kilogram and contained roughly 2,000 individual strips. A typical Lancaster would carry approximately 2,000 bundles. Do the math. That's 4 million strips of foil per aircraft. Multiply that by 700 bombers, and you're looking at nearly 3 billion pieces of aluminum foil about to be dropped on German radar defenses in a single night. The logistics were staggering. Window bundles had to be distributed to bomber stations across England, loaded onto aircraft alongside bombs and fuel, all while maintaining absolute operational security. Ground crews were told they were loading anti-submarine detection devices. Only air crews who would actually deploy the material knew its true purpose, and they received briefings on the day of the mission. Security was paranoid for good reason. If word leaked, if the Germans got even a hint of what was coming, they could prepare countermeasures. The entire advantage would evaporate. July 24, 1943, dawned clear across England. Weather reconnaissance confirmed favorable conditions over Hamburg. The mission was on. Afternoon briefings commenced across dozens of airfields. Crews gathered in operations rooms to learn their target. When Hamburg appeared on the maps, few were surprised. The city had been hit before, but when intelligence officers revealed Window, when they explained what those bundles stacked in their aircraft actually did, the atmosphere changed. This raid would be different. This raid might change everything. Flight Sergeant James Murphy, a navigator on a Lancaster, later recalled the moment. "We'd all heard rumors," he said, "whispers about some new secret weapon. When they showed us the foil strips, I thought someone was joking. This is what's supposed to save our lives." Aluminum foil. But the briefing officers were deadly serious. Push the bundles down the flare chute every minute. Start 15 minutes from the German coast. Don't stop until you're heading home. The rhythm was crucial. If you stopped deploying Window, your aircraft would suddenly appear clearly on German radar screens. You'd be marked for death. As darkness fell, over 700 heavy bombers prepared for takeoff. 347 Avro Lancasters, 246 Handley Page Halifaxes, 125 Short Stirlings, 73 Vickers Wellingtons. Each aircraft carried a mixture of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries, designed to shatter buildings and ignite the debris. And each carried those bundles of aluminum foil that cost pennies to produce, but might be worth more than all the bombs combined. The first aircraft departed at approximately 10 p.m. They formed up over the North Sea in a bomber stream over 200 kilometers long, a river of aircraft flowing eastward toward Germany. Navigator tables were stacked with window bundles, taking up space normally reserved for equipment and personal items. At the designated point, 15 minutes from the German coast, crews began pushing bundles down the flare chute. The aluminum strips tumbled through the night sky, separating and spreading as they fell. Each bundle created a radar signature equivalent to a bomber for several minutes before dispersing too widely to reflect effectively. With bundles being deployed every minute from hundreds of aircraft, the cumulative effect was about to be catastrophic for German radar operators. At Stade Radar Station, approximately 60 kilometers northwest of Hamburg, Oberfeldwebel Hartmann watched his Freya scope at 11:56 p.m. The first indications appeared as a faint increase in returns. Then, in seconds, his screen transformed. The normal, neat procession of discrete blips became a solid mass of contacts. He couldn't count them, couldn't track them, couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. He called his supervisor immediately, certain his equipment was malfunctioning. Across the Kammhuber line, similar scenes unfolded. Würzburg. Operators attempting to provide precision tracking for night fighters found their scopes completely saturated. The tracking system relied on identifying individual aircraft and vectoring fighters toward them. Now, instead of tracking one bomber, each radar set showed dozens or hundreds of equally strong returns. The system simply collapsed under information overload. Hauptmann Helmut Lent, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced night fighter controllers, attempted to coordinate defenses from his command post. His carefully structured system of interception boxes had become useless. Pilots reported that their airborne Liechtenstein radars showed the same bewildering mass of contacts. They couldn't distinguish real bombers from whatever was creating these phantom returns. Some night fighter pilots operating on visual sighting and instinct managed to find bomber streams and engage. Oberleutnant Werner Bach, flying a Bf 110, visually acquired a Halifax silhouetted against searchlights and shot it down over the Elbe estuary. But these successes were isolated. The systematic radar-directed slaughter the German night fighters normally inflicted had become impossible. Anti-aircraft batteries fared no better. Radar-predicted flak relied on Würzburg sets to provide accurate altitude and position data for calculating firing solutions. With the radar sets showing only a confused mass of targets, gun crews reverted to barrage fire, throwing shells into the bomber stream based on sound and searchlight estimates. This was far less effective than radar-directed fire, wasting ammunition and creating minimal danger for bombers maintaining proper altitude. For the bomber crews, the difference was immediately apparent. Flight Sergeant Murphy remembered the moment clearly. "We were approaching the coast," he said, "and I was pushing window bundles down every minute like they'd told us, waiting for the searchlights to lock on, waiting for the flak to find our altitude. But it never came. The searchlights swept around randomly. The flak was bursting thousands of feet below us. It was like they were blind." The bomber stream reached Hamburg shortly after midnight. Pathfinder aircraft equipped with specialized navigation aids marked the target area with colored flares and incendiaries. The main force followed, dropping 2,896 tons of bombs across the city's northern districts. The mix of high explosives and incendiaries was carefully calculated. High explosive bombs would shatter buildings and rupture water mains. Incendiaries would ignite the debris. The combination had proven effective in previous raids, but never at this scale, never with this concentration. German civil defense personnel watched in horror as fires erupted across multiple districts simultaneously. The normal procedure involved concentrating fire brigades on the worst hit areas, containing blazes before they spread. But with hundreds of fires igniting at once, resources were immediately overwhelmed. Hamburg's fire services, considered among Europe's best, found themselves unable to respond effectively to the simultaneous emergencies. By 3 a.m., the last bombers were crossing back over the North Sea toward England. Aircrew debriefings revealed the dramatic effectiveness of Window. Crews reported minimal night fighter activity and reduced flak accuracy. Initial estimates suggested losses would be remarkably light compared to previous Hamburg raids. As dawn broke over England on July 25th, the true scale of Window's success became apparent. Of the 791 aircraft dispatched, only 12 failed to return, a loss rate of just 1.5%. This was extraordinary. Previous raids on heavily defended targets like Hamburg typically suffered losses of 4 to 6%, sometimes higher. Window had effectively cut losses to a quarter of normal rates. The human dimension of this statistic was profound. Approximately 80 aircrews had been spared death or captivity because German radar defenses had been blinded. Air Marshal Harris's gamble had paid immediate dividends. In Hamburg, morning revealed the extent of the night's devastation. The raid had killed approximately 1,500 people and rendered 24,000 homeless. Entire blocks of apartment buildings had been reduced to smoking rubble. But this was only the beginning. Harris had no intention of allowing Hamburg to recover. The strategic concept behind Gomorrah involved repeated attacks over several days, preventing effective firefighting and rescue operations, maintaining pressure on civil defense services, breaking the city's ability to function. German military leadership reacted with shock and confusion to Window's deployment. General Joseph Kammhuber, architect of Germany's air defense network, immediately recognized that his entire system had been rendered obsolete overnight. He ordered urgent investigation into the nature of the countermeasure and demanded solutions from German scientists and engineers. Captured window bundles reached German laboratories within hours. Scientists identified the strips as simple aluminum foil cut to specific wavelengths. The simplicity was almost insulting. This wasn't some advanced technology requiring industrial facilities or rare materials. It was something any nation with aluminum and scissors could produce. German researchers had independently discovered this principle years earlier. They called it Düppel, but had never deployed it for the same reasons that had paralyzed British decision-making: fear of enemy retaliation. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, flew into a rage when briefed on the situation. He had repeatedly assured Hitler that German airspace was secure. That radar technology provided an impenetrable shield. Now that shield had been shattered by strips of foil. Göring demanded immediate countermeasures and scapegoats. Several radar officers were relieved of command, despite bearing no responsibility for the technological surprise. But firing people didn't solve the problem. Germany's air defense network had been built around radar superiority. That superiority was gone. German engineers worked frantically to develop solutions. The most immediate fix involved trying to distinguish real bombers from window clouds by observing which radar returns moved in consistent patterns. Window strips fluttered chaotically as they fell, creating relatively stationary or erratically moving contacts. Real bombers followed predictable courses. This technique, called manual tracking, required skilled operators and was far less effective than the automated systems Window had defeated. It was something, but it wasn't enough. British intelligence monitored German reactions through ultra-intercepts of Enigma encrypted communications. The decrypts revealed the depth of German confusion and the absence of immediate countermeasures. This intelligence confirmed that Bomber Command could continue exploiting Window's advantages for the foreseeable future. Harris ordered intensified operations against German cities, knowing his crews now possessed a protective advantage that significantly improved their survival odds. Hamburg, however, would bear the brunt of this revelation. The city's ordeal was far from over. Bomber Command returned to Hamburg on the night of July 27th-28th for the operation's second major raid. Once again, Window saturated German radar screens, preventing effective interception. But this raid would produce something far worse than the first attack. Hamburg was about to experience one of history's most devastating firestorms. The weather conditions were perfect for catastrophe. Hamburg had experienced several weeks of unusual heat and drought. Buildings damaged in the first raid remained unrepaired, their shattered windows and damaged roofs creating ideal conditions for fire spread. The city's working-class eastern districts featured dense concentrations of older buildings with timber construction and closely spaced structures. At approximately 12:57 a.m. on July 28th, the first markers went down over Hamburg's Hammerbrook and Rothenburg's Soort districts. These densely populated areas housed workers from Hamburg's port and industrial facilities. The neighborhood's narrow streets and closely packed apartments created what firefighters call good fire conditions, circumstances where flames can easily jump from building to building. The main force of 787 bombers dropped 2,326 tons of ordnance in just 50 minutes, creating an unprecedented concentration of destruction. The bomb mix was approximately two-thirds incendiaries, specifically selected to maximize fire starting. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires merged into dozens of conflagrations. Then something unprecedented occurred. The multiple conflagrations began generating enormous thermal updrafts as thousands of tons of material burned simultaneously. These updrafts drew in fresh air from surrounding areas, creating winds that grew progressively stronger. By 2 a.m., sustained winds of over 150 kilometers per hour were roaring through Hamburg's eastern districts, feeding the flames with hurricane-force drafts of oxygen. Temperatures in the fire zone reached 800 degrees Celsius. Asphalt streets melted and ignited. People caught in basements or shelters were killed not by flames, but by carbon monoxide poisoning and heat so intense it boiled their internal organs. Those who attempted to flee through the streets were often blown over by the wind or sucked back into the inferno. One survivor later described the sound as resembling 1,000 screaming sirens. The firestorm was self-perpetuating and unstoppable. Hamburg's fire services couldn't even approach the affected districts. Any attempt to fight the fires from the periphery proved futile, as the flames simply consumed everything combustible and moved on. The conflagration burned until it ran out of fuel, finally subsiding after dawn when there was simply nothing left to burn. When the fires finally died, approximately 8 square miles of Hamburg had been completely destroyed. The exact death toll will never be known with certainty, as many victims were completely incinerated, leaving no remains to count. Official estimates placed fatalities at approximately 37,000 people, though some historians believe the true number exceeded 40,000. This made it the deadliest air raid in European history to that point. Flight Lieutenant George Graham, a Lancaster pilot, flew over Hamburg the following day on a reconnaissance mission. "What I saw," he later wrote, "didn't look like a city anymore. It looked like a moonscape. Just ash and skeletal building frames, no movement, no life, just grey desolation stretching for miles." The firestorm's psychological impact rippled far beyond Hamburg. For the first time, the German population confronted the reality that their cities were vulnerable to catastrophic destruction. Hamburg had been considered one of the best defended cities in Germany, protected by extensive flak batteries and night fighter units. If Hamburg could be devastated so thoroughly, no German city was safe. Hitler received reports on the Hamburg raids with visible fury. He had assured the German people that the Luftwaffe would protect them. That strategic bombing would never threaten the Reich. Now photographs showed entire districts reduced to ash. The Führer demanded immediate retaliation against British cities and solutions to the window problem. Göring, increasingly desperate to regain Hitler's confidence, promised both revenge attacks and technological countermeasures. The revenge component proved hollow. The Luftwaffe simply lacked the bomber strength to mount operations against Britain comparable to what the RAF was now inflicting on Germany. German aircraft production focused on fighters for defense and ground attack aircraft for the Eastern Front. Strategic bombing capacity had been sacrificed for tactical priorities. The few raids Germany could mount against British cities were pinpricks compared to what Hamburg had endured. The technological response proceeded more seriously. German scientists examined captured window samples and developed Dupel, their own version of chaff. By autumn 1943, German bombers were equipped with Dupel for the few raids they could mount against British targets. However, this provided no solution to Germany's defensive problem. You cannot use chaff to protect your own cities. German engineers pursued several approaches to counter window. One method involved using multiple radar frequencies simultaneously. Since window strips were cut to specific wavelengths, using several different frequencies meant some returns would come from actual aircraft, rather than chaff. This helped, but couldn't completely solve the problem. Another approach involved improved operator training and new tactics. Radar operators learned to identify and track returns that moved in consistent patterns, ignoring the relatively stationary window clouds. This manual tracking method required considerable skill and couldn't handle large bomber streams effectively, but it represented some improvement over complete blindness. Meanwhile, Bomber Command pressed its advantage. Between late July and late November 1943, Harris launched the Battle of Berlin, attempting to replicate Hamburg's destruction on the Reich's capital. Berlin proved a tougher target due to its greater distance, size, and defenses, but the raids inflicted severe damage. Window remained effective throughout this campaign, though German countermeasures gradually eroded some of its protective value. The introduction of window fundamentally altered the air war's dynamics. German night fighter effectiveness, measured by bombers destroyed per interception, dropped dramatically after July 1943, while the Luftwaffe later recovered some capability through new tactics and equipment. They never regained the systematic killing efficiency of the pre-window period. British losses remained significant, but no longer reached the unsustainable levels of early 1943. Aircrew survival odds improved measurably. The difference between probable death and possible survival of an operational tour. For the young men flying those missions, window represented something tangible. Hope. A reason to believe they might actually make it through 30 operations and go home. Sergeant David Thompson, a wireless operator, later reflected on what window meant to crews. Before Hamburg, he said, "You didn't plan for after the war. You didn't think about what you'd do when you got home. Because statistically, you weren't going home. Window changed that. Not completely. We still lost people, but it gave us a chance." Ironically, Window's deployment validated the concerns of those who had opposed its use. By early 1944, all combatants in the European theater used chaff routinely. Allied bombers dropped it to protect themselves. German fighters used it to confuse Allied radar defenses, and the technology spread to the Pacific theater. The radar transparency that all sides had enjoyed in 1942 was gone forever, replaced by an environment of electronic warfare and countermeasures that continues to characterize aerial combat today. The tactical innovation that began with window evolved continuously throughout the remainder of World War II and into the modern era. What started as simple aluminum strips dropped from bombers became increasingly sophisticated electronic warfare systems. By 1944, Allied bombers carried multiple types of chaff cut to different frequencies, countering German attempts to develop window-resistant radar. The strips were dispensed by increasingly automated systems, eliminating the need for crew members to manually push bundles down flare chutes. Special window-dropping aircraft would sometimes fly ahead of the main bomber stream, creating corridors of radar clutter through which attackers could pass. The Americans made extensive use of chaff in the Pacific theater, where it proved equally effective against Japanese radar systems. During the massive B-29 raids on Japanese cities in 1944 and 1945, chaff clouds often preceded the bomber streams, blinding early warning networks and disrupting fighter interceptions. The technology that had debuted over Hamburg became standard procedure in all theaters. Modern chaff evolved into highly engineered systems. Contemporary chaff cartridges can be programmed to create specific radar signatures, potentially mimicking not just any aircraft, but particular aircraft types. Some systems deploy multiple chaff clouds in patterns that simulate formation flying, further confusing enemy tracking. The concept pioneered by Window extended beyond radar deception. Flare dispensers create false infrared signatures to decoy heat-seeking missiles. Decoys, both towed behind aircraft and autonomous drones, simulate aircraft signatures across multiple detection spectrums. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. Create false targets that overwhelm enemy sensors and make accurate targeting impossible. The story of Window represents one of World War II's most remarkable technological surprises. A weapon costing pennies to produce, conceived by a small team of scientists, defeated a defensive system that had consumed enormous industrial resources and sophisticated engineering. The contrast between Window's simplicity and its devastating effectiveness illustrates a timeless principle of warfare. Clever innovation often trumps brute force. Operation Gomorrah demonstrated that technology alone cannot guarantee victory. Germany possessed excellent radar systems and skilled operators, but the entire network was vulnerable to a single simple countermeasure. No defense system is invulnerable, and assumptions about technological superiority can become catastrophic weaknesses. The Germans learned this lesson at Hamburg, just as the British might have learned it had Germany discovered chaff first. The decision to deploy Window, delayed for months by fear of German retaliation, shows the difficulty of technological decision-making in warfare. Churchill and his advisors had to weigh immediate tactical advantages against long-term strategic risks, knowing that once revealed, the technology would spread to all combatants. They chose short-term benefit over long-term monopoly, a decision that saved Allied lives, but also ensured that everyone would eventually face chaff-saturated battlefields. The Hamburg firestorm remains one of history's deadliest air raids, a demonstration of strategic bombing's terrifying potential when weather, tactics, and technology combined destructively. The 40,000 civilians who died in Hamburg represent just a fraction of World War II's aerial bombardment casualties. But their deaths occurred in a single concentrated event that shocked even hardened military observers. Hamburg's destruction influenced subsequent bombing strategy, encouraging both sides to pursue similarly devastating attacks. For the young air crews of Bomber Command, Window represented hope and survival. These men, many still in their early 20s, flew mission after mission into defended airspace, knowing that statistically most would not survive. Window measurably improved their odds, turning probable death into possible survival. The aluminum strips fluttering through the night sky were more than tactical deception. They were lifelines for men who counted their remaining lives in sorties. Dr. Joan Curran, who conceived the Window concept, later reflected on her role with mixed feelings. She took pride in the technology's effectiveness and the Allied lives it saved, but also acknowledged the enormous destruction it facilitated. Her experience reflects the broader moral complexity of scientific work in wartime, where innovations designed to save lives on one side inevitably kill people on the other. The physical evidence of Operation Gomorrah has largely vanished. Hamburg was rebuilt after the war, its destroyed districts replaced by modern structures. A few memorials mark the firestorm's impact, but the city of 1943 exists now only in photographs, survivor testimony, and historical records. The last survivors of that July night are now in their 80s and 90s, their memories of the firestorm's horror fading with them. Window bundles, once manufactured by the millions, are now museum curiosities. You can see samples at the RAF Museum in London and the Imperial War Museum. Small aluminum strips preserved behind glass, silent testament to their once decisive role. They seem almost absurd. How could something so simple, so cheap, so basic have changed the course of the air war? Yet that absurdity is precisely the point. War rarely rewards complexity for its own sake. Simple solutions, effectively applied, often prove more valuable than sophisticated systems imperfectly implemented. As we look back across more than 80 years to that July night when British bombers filled German radar screens with ghosts, we see a turning point in military history. The age of radar supremacy lasted only a few years before countermeasures rendered it incomplete. But the broader lesson endures. In technological warfare, no advantage is permanent, no system is invulnerable, and the next surprise is always being prepared in some laboratory, by some scientists solving problems in ways that will seem obvious only in retrospect. Window was one such solution. Simple, elegant, devastating, and ultimately transformative. It changed how wars are fought and how nations defend themselves. A legacy far greater than anyone pushing aluminum strips through a bomber's flare chute that night could have imagined.